The bakery on Clifton Street was supposed to close at 7, but the owner always stayed until the last customer left, because turning away business felt like throwing money into the street. Golden light spilled through the windows onto rain-slicked pavement while the scent of vanilla and caramelized sugar drifted into the evening air. Most people hurried past with collars turned up against the October chill, but one woman stood outside the glass door with her hand resting on a small boy's shoulder. She seemed to be gathering courage for something, the way soldiers pause before stepping into contested territory. Inside, a man in an expensive charcoal suit sat in the corner booth with an untouched espresso growing cold in front of him. His presence filled the space with the kind of weight that made the baker glance his way every few minutes, though she couldn't have explained why if asked. The woman finally pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed with false cheerfulness that seemed to mock the tension in her posture. Her son clutched her hand with the trust children have before life teaches them that adults can't actually protect them from everything. The boy's eyes went immediately to the display case where chocolate eclairs and raspberry tarts sat under warm lights like jewels in a treasure room. His mother kept her gaze on the floor tiles, counting steps the way people do when they're afraid looking up might shatter their resolve. The baker turned from wiping down the counter with a cloth that smelled like lemon disinfectant and bleach. She offered a tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes because closing time meant aching feet and the prospect of doing it all again tomorrow. The woman's voice came out barely above a whisper, words she'd probably rehearsed 20 times in her head before entering. "Is there any expired cake for my little son?" 5 words that contained entire universes of pride, swallowed and dignity sacrificed on the altar of a child's needs. The baker's expression shifted through surprise into something resembling pity, which was exactly what the woman had dreaded seeing in another person's face. Her fingers tightened on the boy's shoulder, in a gesture that could have been reassurance or plea for strength. The man in the corner booth set down his espresso cup, with a precision that suggested he'd just made a decision about something. The soft click of porcelain against saucer carried across the quiet bakery like a bell marking the beginning of something irrevocable. Leo didn't understand why his mother's words made the baker's face change like that, but he felt her hand trembling against his shoulder blade. He'd learned not to ask for things, because asking made his mother's eyes go distant and sad, in ways that frightened him more than going without. The bakery felt warm after the cold street, and the sweetness in the air made his stomach remind him they'd only had soup for lunch. His shoes squeaked on the clean floor, hand-me-downs from a church donation box that were half a size too big and stuffed with newspaper. The baker opened her mouth to respond, but before sound emerged, a chair scraped against tile in the corner. That sound made Nadia's spine straighten with instinctive wariness, because she'd learned to recognize the prelude to moments that changed everything. Casimir Wolf had been coming to this bakery every Thursday evening for 6 weeks, always ordering espresso he never drank and sitting in the same booth where he could watch the street through rain-streaked glass. People who recognized him pretended not to see him, because acknowledging his presence felt like invoking something dangerous into ordinary life. He'd built an empire through understanding leverage and weakness, knowing exactly which pressure points would make grown men crumble. But something in the woman's whispered request cut through the armor of cynicism he'd welded into place over 15 years of calculated brutality. His own mother's voice echoed across decades, asking a butcher for bones to make soup when money had run out, and pride was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. That memory had teeth, and it bit down hard enough to draw blood from parts of himself he thought had gone numb. The woman noticed the stranger rising from his seat, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, without needing to raise his voice. Everything about him screamed money and power, from the Italian leather shoes to the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. His face carried the kind of authority that made people step aside in crowded spaces without being asked. She instinctively pulled Leo closer, the way mothers do when sensing potential threat, even if they can't articulate why. The baker's expression transformed from pity into something closer to fear, which told Nadia everything she needed to know about who this man was in the city's hidden hierarchy. Her pulse quickened with the biological imperative to protect her child from predators, even ones in tailored suits. Casimir approached the counter with measured steps, his presence filling the small bakery, the way expensive cologne lingers in an elevator after its wearer has departed. "I'll take everything in the display case," he said in a voice that carried the faint trace of an accent he'd spent years trying to erase. The baker blinked rapidly as if she'd misheard, while Nadia felt her spine stiffen with defensive pride that bristled against what felt like charity. Money wasn't a problem for Casimir Wolf. It was merely a tool like hammers, or leverage, or carefully applied pressure in negotiations. He pulled out his wallet with practiced ease, leather so soft it probably felt like silk against his fingers. The absurdity of the moment crystallized in the silence that followed his offer. 3 people frozen in a tableau that would redirect all their futures. "That's not necessary," Nadia said, finding her voice somewhere beneath the humiliation that burned in her chest like swallowed acid. Her words came out sharper than intended, defense mechanisms honed through months of rejecting help, because accepting it meant admitting how far they'd fallen. Leo looked up at her with confusion, wrinkling his forehead, because someone wanted to buy them cake, and his mother was saying no. The stranger's eyes met hers for the first time, and something passed between them that wasn't pity or contempt, but recognition of a different sort. She saw her own stubbornness reflected back in his gaze, the pride of someone who'd also learned that accepting help felt like surrendering territory in a war that never really ended. His expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested he'd expected her refusal and had already calculated 3 moves ahead. "It's my nephew's birthday," Casimir lied, with the smooth ease of someone who'd built an empire on calculated deception. "I forgot to order a cake, and everything in here will solve my problem while making a little boy happy." The fiction was transparent as glass, but offered Nadia an escape route from charity into simple transaction, a bridge between pride and necessity. Leo's eyes went wide with hope that someone's birthday might include him in the celebration of sugar and frosting. The baker watched this exchange like a spectator at a chess match played by grandmasters, understanding that something significant was happening, but unable to decode all the moves. Casimir placed $300 bills on the counter, with the casualness of someone who kept that amount in his pocket for tips and emergencies. Nadia wanted to refuse again, to gather Leo and walk out with her dignity intact, even if her son went to bed hungry again. But she'd learned that pride was expensive, and sometimes the price was paid by people other than yourself, who didn't get to choose whether they could afford it. Leo's hand in hers felt small and trusting in a way that made decisions for her when her own resolve wavered. "Thank you," she said finally, the words tasting like defeat and relief in equal measure. The stranger nodded once, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement without triumph, because he understood that accepting help required its own form of courage. The baker began boxing pastries with hands that moved too quickly, nervous energy finding outlet in practical action as she tried to process what she'd just witnessed. Casimir returned to his corner booth, while the baker wrapped pastries in tissue paper and placed them carefully in boxes that smelled like cardboard and possibility. He didn't watch the woman and her son directly, but he tracked their movements in the reflection of the darkened window beside him. Years of surviving in a world where inattention meant death had trained him to observe without seeming to catalog threats and opportunities in the same sweeping glance. The boy's face lit up with joy so pure it seemed obscene in the cynical universe Casimir inhabited, where happiness was a weapon people used against you once they understood what you valued. Leo pressed his nose against the display case glass, leaving a small fog of breath that bloomed and faded like temporary hope. His mother tried to pull him back gently, aware that they were accepting charity disguised as convenience and shouldn't push their luck further. Casimir's mind drifted to a kitchen in South Boston, where his mother had stood at a stove that only had 2 working burners and called it making do. She'd stretched one chicken into 3 days of meals through alchemy that involved more prayer than ingredients. He'd been 7 years old, the same age as the boy in the bakery, when he'd learned that hunger wasn't just an empty stomach, but a hollowing out of dignity that happened one missed meal at a time. His father had been gone by then, swallowed by the same streets that would eventually claim Casimir's innocence and replace it with something harder and infinitely more useful. The neighborhood they'd lived in had 2 types of people, those who accepted their circumstances with quiet resignation and those who clawed their way out by any means necessary. His mother had been the former, and he'd sworn to become the latter from the moment he understood that goodness didn't pay rent. The memory of his mother asking for expired meat at the butcher shop still made something twist in his chest 30 years later. The butcher had been kind about it, wrapping the bones and scraps in clean paper as if they were premium cuts, preserving her dignity while acknowledging her need. That small act of grace had stuck with Casimir through years of brutality and moral compromises that would have horrified the woman who'd raised him. He'd built his empire through understanding that everyone had a price, not always monetary but always present if you knew where to look. Fear worked better than money in most negotiations because people could spend money, but fear regenerated itself daily like interest on an unpaid debt. He'd learned to weaponize both with surgical precision, becoming the kind of man whose name made other criminals reconsider their ambitions. But the empire had cost him everything that made the victory worth having in the first place. He lived in a penthouse that felt like a mausoleum decorated by someone with excellent taste and no soul. His bed was always empty except for him, because letting someone close enough to matter meant giving them the knife they'd eventually use to cut your throat. Loneliness was the price of power, and he'd paid it without complaint, because complaining was for people who still believed the universe cared about their suffering. The woman and her son finished collecting their boxes of pastries, each one representing a small miracle in their evening that had started with humiliation and ended with more food than they'd probably seen in weeks. Casimir watched Nadia's hands shake slightly as she held the boxes, the tremor of someone who'd been so tense for so long that relief felt dangerous. She glanced his direction once, their eyes meeting across the distance of the small bakery. What passed between them in that look transcended simple gratitude, because both recognized in the other a specific kind of survivor. She'd been knocked down by life and was still fighting to stand, while he'd clawed his way to the top and found the view disappointingly empty. Her struggle was ascending while his was finding something worth the climb. Two people on opposite trajectories of the same bitter journey through a world that rewarded ruthlessness over kindness. "Say thank you to the nice man," Nadia prompted Leo, her voice carrying forced lightness that barely covered the emotional exhaustion underneath. The boy turned toward Casimir with cake boxes clutched against his chest like treasure he'd been entrusted to protect. His eyes held no wariness or calculation, just uncomplicated happiness that someone had been kind for no reason he could understand. "Thank you, sir," Leo said, with the careful pronunciation of a child who'd been taught manners, even when life hadn't given him much opportunity to use them. The words were simple, but they landed on Casimir with unexpected weight, because genuine gratitude was rare in his world. People thanked him out of fear or obligation, but never with the transparent sincerity of a 7-year-old who didn't know enough to be strategically polite. Casimir nodded once, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he attempted words. The boy smiled wider, apparently satisfied with the response, and turned back to his mother who was already guiding him toward the door. The bell chimed again as they left, the sound marking their departure into the cold October evening, with boxes of pastries that would make tonight different from all the nights that had come before. The baker stood behind her counter, looking like she'd witnessed something religious in its mystery, a transaction that followed no economic logic she understood. "That was kind of you, Mr. Wolf," she said carefully, using his name for the first time, though she'd always known exactly who he was. Her tone carried the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that complimenting dangerous men required delicate calibration. "Box up another dozen of whatever's left," Casimir said, ignoring her comment entirely. "Send it to the address I'm about to give you tomorrow morning." He pulled out his phone and typed quickly, then showed her the screen with an address in the subsidized housing district on the east side. The baker's eyes widened slightly, because that neighborhood was where hope went to die slowly over generations of inherited poverty. "Is there a name I should—" she began, but Casimir cut her off with a slight shake of his head. Anonymous generosity served multiple purposes, protecting both the giver and receiver from the complications that came with acknowledged debt. In his world, debts were currency more valuable than money, because they could be called in when circumstances required leverage. But this particular gesture existed outside that economy, a transaction he needed to remain uncounted in any ledger. He placed 2 more $100 bills on the counter to cover tomorrow's delivery and ensure the baker's discretion. Money bought silence more reliably than threats in most situations, and he preferred the former when possible, because fear made people unpredictable, while greed made them compliant. She took the bills without comment, understanding implicitly that some questions weren't meant to be asked by people who wanted to continue their comfortable ignorance. Casimir stood and buttoned his suit jacket with the automatic gesture of someone whose appearance was armor as much as vanity. The espresso on the table had gone completely cold, useless now like most things he paid for, but never actually consumed. His driver would be waiting outside in the black sedan with tinted windows, ready to transport him back to the penthouse where silence echoed off marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows showed him a city he owned but didn't belong to. But before leaving, he paused at the counter and looked at the baker with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. "The woman and her son," he said quietly, his voice carrying no threat but absolute certainty. "If they come in again, everything they want is already paid for. Don't tell them that. Just say the bakery has a policy about day-old items for families who need them." The baker nodded quickly, recognizing a command disguised as a request. She'd been running this bakery for 12 years and had learned to read the subtleties of power that wealthy customers carried like cologne. This man wanted to help, but needed it to look like policy rather than pity, institutional kindness rather than personal intervention. She understood that distinction mattered in ways she couldn't fully articulate, but felt in her bones. "How long should I?" she started asking. But again he interrupted with a gesture that made words unnecessary. His hand moved to his inside jacket pocket and emerged with a business card that had only a phone number printed on expensive stock, no name or title to identify its owner. He placed it on the counter between them like a chess piece moving into strategic position. "Call that number when you need to restock what they take," Casimir said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a temporary arrangement, but a permanent infrastructure being built. "Someone will handle the billing directly. Keep your records clean and your questions to yourself." The implications were clear. He was establishing a system that would outlast his personal attention, something that would continue functioning even after his interest inevitably moved elsewhere. The October night had teeth that bit through Nadia's thin jacket as she and Leo walked toward the bus stop 6 blocks away. The pastry boxes weighed almost nothing physically, but felt like they carried the concentrated mass of her entire emotional state. Leo chattered beside her with excitement that came in waves between bites of a chocolate eclair she'd let him eat, despite the sugar content and approaching bedtime. "Mom, do you think we could come back here sometime?" Leo asked, with the careful hopefulness of a child who'd learned that wanting things too badly meant guaranteed disappointment. His words came out slightly muffled around chocolate and cream, face smeared with evidence of his happiness in a way that made Nadia's chest hurt. She wanted to promise him everything, but promises were luxuries for people who had control over their futures. "Maybe," she said, which was the word she used when yes felt like lying and no felt too cruel to say out loud. The bus stop bench was occupied by 2 teenagers sharing headphones and ignoring the world, so she and Leo stood under the shelter while wind found every gap in her clothing. The boxes they carried represented more food than their small refrigerator could reasonably hold, a problem that felt like winning the lottery and realizing you didn't have a bank account. She kept replaying the stranger's face in her mind, trying to decode the expression she'd seen there when their eyes met across the bakery. It hadn't been pity exactly, though that would have been easier to categorize and dismiss. Instead, she'd seen something like recognition, as if he'd looked at her and seen a reflection of someone he used to know. The expensive suit and obvious wealth suggested he'd never experienced the kind of desperation that made you ask for expired cake, but something in his eyes contradicted that assumption. The bus arrived in a cloud of diesel exhaust and hydraulic sighs, its interior lit with harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill. Nadia guided Leo aboard while juggling pastry boxes and trying to dig bus fare from her pocket. The driver was the same woman who worked Thursday evenings, someone who'd watched Nadia's slow descent over months with the studied neutrality of public servants who couldn't afford emotional investment in every tragedy they witnessed. "Those smell good," the driver commented, nodding at the boxes while Nadia fed crumpled bills into the machine. It was the first personal thing the woman had said to her in 6 months of identical Thursday evening rides, a small acknowledgement that something had shifted in Nadia's circumstances, even if only temporarily. Leo found them seats near the back, while Nadia clutched the boxes against her chest to protect them from the bus's lurching movements through traffic. "Is that man your friend?" Leo asked once they were settled, his voice pitched low, because the bus carried 3 other passengers who might overhear. The question was innocent but complicated in ways Nadia couldn't begin to explain to a 7-year-old. She didn't even know the stranger's name, had no claim to friendship or connection beyond a single transaction in a bakery that lasted less than 10 minutes. "No, baby, just someone being kind," she answered, though the words felt insufficient for what had actually happened. The man had seen her humiliation and responded with something that preserved her dignity while meeting her need, a balancing act that required emotional intelligence she hadn't expected from someone who wore wealth like armor. Most rich people either ignored poverty or performed charity with theatrical self-congratulation, but he'd done neither. Leo accepted this explanation with a child's ability to move past complexity toward simpler concerns, specifically whether he could have another pastry when they got home. Nadia told him maybe tomorrow, establishing boundaries even as her own stomach reminded her they'd skipped dinner entirely. The bus rolled through neighborhoods that marked the city's economic geography, moving from the commercial district where bakeries sold $7 lattes toward the east side, where hope came in the form of check-cashing services and lottery tickets. Their apartment building came into view after 20 minutes of stops and starts. a 5-story structure that had been modern in 1970 and was now just tired. The lobby smelled like cleaning chemicals fighting a losing battle against decades of cooking odors and human occupancy. Their apartment was on the 4th floor, accessed by stairs because the elevator had been broken for 6 weeks, and the landlord's promises of repair had the hollow ring of lies everyone recognized, but couldn't challenge. Nadia's legs burned by the 2nd floor landing because malnutrition and stress had eroded her stamina down to fumes and willpower. Leo climbed ahead of her with the resilience of childhood, apparently fueled by sugar and excitement, rather than any reasonable energy source. She paused at the 3rd floor landing to catch her breath, leaning against the railing while holding pastry boxes that now felt considerably heavier than they had when leaving the bakery. "You okay, Mom?" Leo asked from several steps above, looking back with concern that children shouldn't have to feel for their parents. She nodded and continued climbing because the alternative was sitting down on concrete stairs that smelled like urine and defeat. The 4th floor hallway stretched before them with flickering fluorescent lights that made everything look like a crime scene waiting to happen. Their apartment was 4F, a 2-room space that generous people might call cozy, and honest people would recognize as cramped. Nadia unlocked 3 separate locks: the building's original, a deadbolt she'd installed herself, and a chain that made her feel marginally safer in a neighborhood where safety was relative rather than guaranteed. Leo rushed inside ahead of her, already planning where to store their treasure of pastries like a general organizing supplies. The apartment's main room served as kitchen, living room, and dining area through creative furniture arrangement and lowered expectations. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs occupied space near the window, while a couch that came from a curbside pickup served as both seating and Nadia's bed at night. Leo's room was barely large enough for his twin mattress and a small dresser, but it was his space, and she'd made it cheerful with drawings he'd done, and stars she'd painted on the ceiling. She set the pastry boxes on the counter, and stood there for a moment, just breathing and trying to process the evening's surreal turn. 24 hours ago, she'd been calculating whether they could afford to buy rice and beans to last the week. Now, their kitchen counter held enough pastries to feed them for days, acquired through a combination of humiliation and inexplicable kindness from a stranger whose motivations she couldn't begin to understand. "Can we save some for breakfast?" Leo called from his room where he'd gone to put away his jacket. The question was practical, showing the kind of strategic thinking that children developed when resources were consistently scarce. Nadia felt her throat tighten, because 7-year-olds should be planning play dates and worrying about homework, not rationing bakery items to maximize their duration. "We can save lots for breakfast," she called back, her voice steadier than her hands as she began transferring pastries to plates and covering them with plastic wrap. The apartment's small refrigerator couldn't hold everything, so she'd have to be strategic about what stayed out and what got preserved. Tomorrow she'd take some to her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd been kind to Leo and sometimes watched him during Nadia's evening shifts at the diner. Sharing the windfall felt important somehow, a way of acknowledging that kindness received should ripple outward rather than being hoarded against future scarcity. She thought again about the stranger in the expensive suit, who'd probably forgotten about them already, moved on to whatever occupied the attention of men who could spend $300 without blinking. But something in his expression when he'd looked at her suggested he wasn't someone who forgot things easily, that he carried his own collection of memories that shaped his actions in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Leo emerged from his room in pajamas that were getting too small, another item on the mental list of things they needed but couldn't afford. He padded across the floor in bare feet and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, a spontaneous gesture of affection that made everything else temporarily irrelevant. "Thank you for taking me to the bakery," he said against her back, words muffled by fabric and proximity. She turned and pulled him into a proper hug, breathing in the smell of his hair that carried traces of the strawberry shampoo they'd gotten from the food bank. "You're welcome, baby," she whispered, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in months. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever struggles waited in the uncertain future, tonight they had full stomachs and pastries for breakfast, and a moment of grace that had arrived from an unexpected source. But Nadia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in ways she didn't fully understand yet, that the stranger's intervention was the beginning of something rather than a self-contained act of kindness. She'd learned to be suspicious of gifts without strings, and men with that much power didn't usually give anything away without expecting something in return. The thought should have worried her more than it did, but exhaustion was finally catching up, and she needed sleep more than she needed to analyze the motivations of wealthy strangers. Casimir didn't return to his penthouse that night, but instead directed his driver to take him to the warehouse district, where his legitimate businesses operated alongside less legal enterprises. The building looked abandoned from the outside, which was precisely the point, with broken windows that weren't actually broken, and rust that had been applied deliberately to suggest neglect. Inside, the space hummed with activity, as men moved shipments and updated ledgers in an operation that generated millions while maintaining perfect deniability. His office occupied the top floor, a space decorated with the same expensive minimalism as his home, but feeling more authentic somehow, because this was where actual work happened. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor where container ships moved like sleeping giants through dark water. He poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter, then stood at the window without drinking it, because the ritual mattered more than the consumption. Marcus Chen, his second-in-command, and the closest thing he had to a friend, knocked twice before entering even though the door was open. "You're here late," Marcus observed, moving to the small bar and pouring his own drink with the familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to make himself comfortable. His tone carried no question because asking Casimir direct questions about his mood or motivations was a boundary they'd established years ago through unspoken agreement. "Couldn't sleep," Casimir said, which was both true and insufficient explanation for why he'd chosen to come here instead of lying awake in his penthouse, staring at ceilings that cost more per square foot than most people earned monthly. Marcus settled into one of the leather chairs with the patience of someone who understood that silence sometimes preceded important revelations. They'd known each other since juvenile detention, two teenagers who'd recognized in each other the specific hunger that separated survivors from victims. The Thompson shipment cleared customs without issues, Marcus reported, shifting into business mode because that was safer territory than whatever was actually bothering Casimir. "The profit margin is better than projected, and I've already allocated the surplus according to your previous instructions." His efficiency was one reason Casimir trusted him with operational details, but the real reason was simpler. Marcus was smart enough to know that loyalty paid better than betrayal in the long run. Casimir nodded absently, his mind still replaying the scene in the bakery with an obsessive quality that annoyed him, because he'd built his empire on the ability to compartmentalize and move forward. "Do you remember being hungry?" he asked suddenly, the question emerging without his conscious permission. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of surprise before his expression smoothed back into neutrality. The question was personal in a way Casimir usually avoided, a breach of their unspoken protocol about keeping the past where it belonged. "Every day until I was 15 and started making my own money," Marcus answered after a pause that suggested he was calculating whether honesty or deflection served him better. "Why are you asking?" The counter-question was gentle but firm, pushing back against the unusual intimacy while leaving space for Casimir to retreat if he wanted. Between them, vulnerability was currency that needed to be spent carefully, because showing weakness was dangerous, even among allies. Casimir told him about the bakery, about the woman and her son, and the request that had cut through his usual detachment like a blade finding the gap between armor plates. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing except the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood the significance, even if he couldn't articulate why. When Casimir finished, silence settled between them, heavy as humidity before a storm. "You thinking about doing something stupid?" Marcus asked finally, his tone walking the line between concern and warning. "Because helping people tends to get complicated in our line of work, especially when those people are vulnerable." The practical assessment was accurate, but irritating, because Casimir already knew all the reasons why getting involved was strategically unsound. Compassion was a liability in their world, something enemies could weaponize once they identified your pressure points. "I already set up an account at the bakery," Casimir admitted, which made Marcus's expression shift into something between resignation and exasperation. "Anonymous. The baker will make sure they're taken care of when they come back." He said it casually, as if establishing infrastructure for strangers was a normal Thursday evening activity, rather than the kind of sentimental gesture that contradicted everything he'd built his reputation on. Marcus took a long drink before responding, buying time to choose his words carefully. "You understand that kindness creates obligations even when you don't want it to," he said slowly, each word weighted with implications. "The woman finds out you're behind it. She'll either feel indebted or suspicious. Either way, you've created a connection that can be exploited." His logic was sound, the same pragmatic analysis Casimir would have offered if their positions were reversed. "Then she doesn't find out," Casimir replied with finality that suggested the conversation was approaching its endpoint. "It stays anonymous, stays clean, stays separate from everything else. Even as he said it, he recognized the futility of trying to control outcomes through sheer will when human emotion was involved. But acknowledging that would require admitting he cared about the outcome beyond abstract principle, and that admission felt too dangerous to voice even here. The following Thursday, Casimir returned to the bakery at the same time, ordering the same espresso he wouldn't drink and sitting in the same corner booth. The baker recognized him immediately and gave a small nod that confirmed the arrangement was being honored. He'd timed his arrival for 7 o'clock, the closing hour when desperation made people take risks like asking for expired cake. The street outside remained empty except for the usual evening traffic of people hurrying home. She appeared at 7:15, later than the previous week, with Leo beside her looking slightly less tired than before. Nadia's posture was different this time, carrying more wariness and less defeat, as if the previous week's kindness had restored some measure of caution, along with her dignity. She pushed open the door with visible hesitation, and her eyes went immediately to the corner booth where Casimir sat pretending to read something on his phone. Their gazes met for exactly 2 seconds before she looked away, but in that brief connection, something passed between them that felt like continuation, rather than coincidence. She approached the counter with Leo's hand in hers, and this time she didn't whisper her request, but spoke clearly enough for Casimir to hear without straining. "Do you have any day-old items available?" The phrasing was different, less humiliating, asking for policy rather than begging for charity. The baker smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though Casimir knew she was simply following his instructions with the professionalism of someone who understood which side her bread was buttered on. "We have a family program for day-old baked goods," she said, using the exact script Casimir had provided. "You're welcome to take what you need." She gestured toward a separate display case that Casimir had paid to keep stocked specifically for this purpose. Nadia's expression shifted through confusion into cautious hope, before settling on suspicious gratitude, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to determine whether this was legitimate policy or elaborate setup. "I wasn't aware of any program last week," she said carefully, testing the waters for holes in the story. The baker handled the challenge smoothly, explaining that the program had just been implemented by the bakery's owner, who wanted to reduce waste while helping families. Leo pressed against the display case with renewed excitement, pointing at items while asking his mother if they could take specific pastries. Nadia agreed to selections with the kind of careful rationing that came from never knowing when abundance might return to scarcity. Casimir watched this interaction through peripheral vision while maintaining the appearance of disinterest, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name and didn't want to examine too closely. She left with 2 boxes instead of the previous week's overwhelming haul, taking only what they could reasonably use before items went stale. The restraint impressed him because it suggested pride that hadn't been completely eroded by necessity, a refusal to exploit kindness, even when opportunity presented itself. As the door closed behind them, Casimir allowed himself one direct look at her retreating form, memorizing the set of her shoulders and the way she held her son's hand like it was the only anchor keeping her from drifting away entirely. "Same time next week?" the baker asked, approaching his table with coffee pot in hand even though his cup was still full. Her tone was carefully neutral, but her eyes held curiosity she was smart enough not to voice. Casimir nodded once, and she retreated behind her counter to begin closing procedures. He sat there for another 20 minutes after she'd locked the door, alone with his thoughts, and the growing certainty that anonymous charity wasn't going to be sufficient for very long. The 3rd Thursday, Casimir arrived at the bakery to find Nadia already there, sitting at a small table near the window with Leo working on homework beside her. The unexpected deviation from pattern made his pulse quicken with something between concern and interest. She'd come early, which suggested either increased comfort with the arrangement or strategic planning to avoid him specifically. He took his usual booth and watched her pretend not to notice his arrival. Leo was practicing cursive letters on lined paper, his tongue visible between his teeth in concentration. Nadia corrected his grip on the pencil with gentle patience, her voice too quiet for Casimir to hear, but her body language speaking volumes about the kind of mother she was despite circumstances. The scene was aggressively normal, the kind of domestic tableau that existed in thousands of homes across the city every evening, yet it transfixed him with its simple intimacy. The bakery felt different with them already present when he arrived, as if their presence had somehow rearranged the molecular structure of the space. Casimir ordered his espresso from a new employee, who didn't know to leave him alone, then had to politely decline conversation about the weather and traffic. The interruption annoyed him, because it disrupted his observation, breaking the fourth wall between watcher and watched in a way that felt like violation of unspoken rules. Nadia helped Leo pack up his homework after 30 minutes, preparing to collect their weekly allocation of day-old pastries before heading home. But as she approached the counter, she paused and turned toward Casimir's booth with the deliberate movement of someone who'd been building courage for this exact moment. Her shoulders were squared, chin lifted in defensive pride, and her eyes held direct challenge rather than gratitude when they met his across the bakery's small space. "I know it's you," she said simply, her voice carrying across the empty bakery with clarity that made pretense impossible. The baker froze behind the counter, her expression cycling through alarm, before settling on careful neutrality that suggested she planned to claim ignorance, regardless of how this confrontation resolved. Leo looked between his mother and the stranger, with confusion beginning to shade into concern, because children could sense adult tension, even when they couldn't understand its source. Casimir's initial instinct was denial, but something in Nadia's expression told him she wouldn't accept the lie, and attempting it would insult them both. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said anyway, giving her the option to retreat from confrontation if she wanted. His tone was mild, non-committal, the verbal equivalent of raised hands showing he carried no weapons. But they both knew he was lying, and they both knew she knew it, which made the denial more acknowledgement than rebuttal. "The family program that started exactly 1 week after we met," Nadia continued, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands that betrayed nervousness beneath the brave front. "The baker who suddenly has day-old items available every Thursday at 7:15, which coincidentally is exactly when we arrive. The fact that you've been here every time we come, sitting in that same booth watching us like we're some kind of project." Her analysis was accurate enough to be impressive and concerning in equal measure. He stood slowly, a gesture meant to show respect rather than intimidation, though his height and bearing carried inherent threat regardless of intention. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, nodding toward the booth's opposite seat. The invitation was dangerous for multiple reasons, crossing boundaries between anonymous benefactor and known entity, but maintaining the charade seemed more insulting than honest conversation. Nadia hesitated, her protective instincts warring with curiosity and the pragmatic understanding that refusing might jeopardize the arrangement that had been feeding her son. "Leo, stay at the table and finish your homework," she instructed, her mom voice carrying authority that made the boy nod immediately, despite his obvious desire to understand what was happening. She crossed to Casimir's booth and slid into the opposite seat with the rigid posture of someone sitting for a job interview or police interrogation. Up close, he could see exhaustion etched into lines around her eyes that hadn't been visible from across the room, the physical evidence of months or years spent in survival mode. "Why?" she asked, the single word containing multitudes of questions about motivation and expectation and what debt she was accruing without her consent. Her hands were clasped on the table between them, knuckles white with tension that belied her controlled expression. Casimir recognized the look because he'd seen it on 100 faces across negotiating tables when people were trying to appear stronger than they felt. She was terrified, he realized, but refusing to let that terror dictate her actions. "Does it matter?" he countered, genuinely curious whether his motivation would change her acceptance of help. In his experience, people rarely looked too closely at gift horses when they were starving, preferring comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth. But Nadia didn't strike him as someone who chose comfort over clarity, which made her both admirable and exhausting in the way that principled people always were to pragmatists who'd abandoned principles as inefficient luxuries. "Yes," she said firmly, leaning forward slightly in emphasis, "because men like you don't do things without reason, and I need to know what you think I owe you." The directness was refreshing, even as it complicated everything, forcing him to articulate motivations he hadn't fully examined himself. She wasn't wrong about the transactional nature of his world, where every gesture accumulated interest that would eventually need to be paid. But this situation existed outside that economy, in a space he hadn't known was available until stumbling into it accidentally. "You don't owe me anything," Casimir said, meaning it more than he'd meant most true statements in his adult life. "I saw someone who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. That's all." The explanation was technically accurate, but emotionally insufficient, skipping over the part where her whispered request had detonated something in his chest that had been dormant for decades. Admitting that would require vulnerability he wasn't prepared to offer to a stranger, even one whose desperation had somehow become his responsibility. Nadia studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read a contract's fine print in dim lighting, searching for the catch that experience promised must exist. "People don't help for no reason," she insisted, her certainty born from a lifetime of learning that altruism was a myth told by the secure to explain why they weren't helping more. "Especially not people like you who wear watches worth more than I'll make in 5 years. So what do you actually want?" The question hung between them, weighted with accusation and fear, and the desperate hope that maybe, impossibly, he might be the exception that proved the rule. Casimir felt the familiar urge to retreat behind the walls he'd built, to separate his public face from anything resembling authentic feeling. But something about her directness demanded equivalent honesty, even if that honesty revealed more than was strategically wise. He took a breath and made a choice that would redirect both their trajectories in ways neither could fully anticipate. "I want to offer you a job," he said, the decision crystallizing even as words emerged. Marcus would call this stupid, probably correctly, but Casimir had spent 30 years making pragmatic choices that left him wealthy and isolated. Something legitimate, stable, with actual benefits, and a salary that would let you stop choosing between rent and food. The offer was impulsive by his usual standards, but felt inevitable somehow, as if the past 3 weeks had been building toward exactly this moment of intersection between her need and his resources. Nadia's expression cycled through disbelief into suspicion before landing somewhere near cautious interest. "Doing what?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected the answer to reveal this as prelude to something inappropriate or illegal. Her guard was up, which was smart, because men in his position rarely offered women in hers legitimate employment, without strings attached that choked. But Casimir had strings enough in his life, and no interest in adding manipulation to whatever this was becoming. "I own a restaurant in the financial district," he explained, which was true, though incomplete, since he also owned the building, and 3 others on the same block. "We need daytime staff for the cafe section that handles breakfast and lunch service. Normal hours. Nothing that would interfere with getting Leo to school or being home for dinner." He was already mentally restructuring the business to create a position that would fit her circumstances, a habit of bending reality to accommodate his decisions that usually applied to less wholesome objectives. "Why would you do that?" Nadia asked, circling back to motivation with the persistence of someone who understood that unanswered questions had a way of becoming problems later. "You don't know anything about me, whether I'm reliable or competent or even honest. This doesn't make sense." Her skepticism was warranted, and Casimir respected her enough to wish he had a better answer than instinct, and the ghost of his mother's voice asking a butcher for bones to make soup. "Call it intuition," he said, knowing it was insufficient, but unable to offer more without revealing the complicated tangle of guilt and memory, an inexplicable connection that had formed around her and her son. "You show up every week at the same time. You only take what you need, and you're raising a good kid under circumstances that would break most people. That tells me more than a resume would." The assessment was genuine, drawn from years of evaluating character under pressure, though he left out the part where helping them was helping some version of himself that still existed in memory. Nadia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for deception, while her mind probably calculated risks against potential benefits. "I'd need to know more details," she said finally. Neither acceptance nor refusal, but willingness to continue the conversation. "Salary, schedule, exactly what the job would involve. And I'd need it in writing because verbal promises don't mean anything when circumstances change." Her conditions were reasonable, almost disappointingly so, because part of him had hoped she might just say yes and let him fix everything quickly. The restaurant was called Meridian, occupying the ground floor of a steel and glass tower that Casimir's shell companies had purchased during the last recession. He'd asked Nadia to meet him there on Saturday afternoon when the space would be closed for deep cleaning and staff meetings. She'd agreed with visible reluctance, bringing Leo because finding childcare for a meeting about employment she wasn't sure she'd accept felt like tempting fate with premature optimism. The interior was elegant, without being ostentatious, decorated in warm neutrals with art on the walls that looked expensive because it was. Natural light flooded through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a small park, where office workers ate lunch and pretended the city wasn't slowly crushing them. Leo's eyes went wide, taking in the space, his small-town amazement at urban luxury making Casimir remember when he'd felt the same way about places where people ate food that cost more than his mother's weekly grocery budget. Marcus was waiting inside, his presence a statement about Casimir's seriousness that might have been overkill, but served the purpose of legitimizing the offer. "This is Marcus Chen. He manages operations for my business interests," Casimir explained, watching Nadia evaluate Marcus with the same careful scrutiny she'd applied to everything. Marcus extended his hand for a handshake that Nadia accepted with visible wariness, clearly understanding that whatever was happening here involved more infrastructure than a simple job offer. "The position would be in our cafe section," Marcus began, launching into details with the efficiency of someone who'd been briefed thoroughly. 7 to 3, Monday through Friday, serving breakfast and lunch to the building's office workers. Starting salary is $48,000 annually, with benefits including health insurance, paid time off, and retirement matching. The numbers were generous without being suspicious, calibrated to lift someone out of poverty while remaining within normal ranges for the industry and position. Nadia listened with the focused attention of someone hearing details that could fundamentally alter their life's trajectory. "What about Leo?" she asked, cutting to the logistics that mattered more than salary. "School starts at 8:30 and ends at 3:15. I'd need flexibility to drop him off and pick him up, or this doesn't work regardless of the pay." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed nervousness, fingers twisting together in her lap while she waited for the answer that would determine everything. "We're prepared to adjust the schedule," Marcus replied smoothly, having clearly anticipated this question. 7:30 to 2:30 gives you time for school drop-off and pick-up with buffer room for traffic or unexpected delays. Your position would focus on morning service prep and lunch coverage, which actually works better for our busiest hours anyway. The flexibility was real rather than performative, though Casimir had specifically designed the role around her constraints in ways that would have been impractical for most businesses. Leo had wandered toward the windows to watch pigeons fight over a discarded sandwich in the park outside, his attention span for adult conversation exhausted. Nadia glanced at him periodically while processing information, her maternal radar operating even while discussing her own future. "And if he's sick, or school is closed, or there's some emergency," she pressed, drilling into the scenarios where theoretical flexibility would be tested against reality's complications. "Reasonable accommodation for parental responsibilities," Casimir interjected, wanting her to hear this directly from him, rather than filtered through Marcus's professional distance. "We're not interested in creating a situation where you have to choose between your job and your son's welfare. That defeats the entire purpose of offering stability." His tone was firmer than intended, revealing more investment in her acceptance than was probably strategically wise. Nadia's eyes met his with an intensity that felt like she was trying to see through his skull into the motivations underneath. "This is real," she said, phrasing it as statement rather than question, but leaving space for confirmation. "Not some elaborate setup for something else, not going to disappear when I show up for the first day. You're actually offering me a legitimate job with the salary and benefits and flexibility you're describing." The disbelief in her voice cut him because it reflected how thoroughly life had taught her that good things were usually traps in disguise. "It's real," he confirmed, holding her gaze steadily so she could search for deception and find none. "Marcus has the written offer letter with all the details we've discussed. You can take it home, review it, show it to a lawyer if you want. No pressure to decide today, though we'd appreciate an answer within the week so we can plan accordingly." The timeline was reasonable, designed to give her space to make an informed decision without the duress of immediate pressure. Marcus produced an envelope from his briefcase with the theatrical timing of a magician revealing the prestige of his trick. Inside was a formal offer letter on company letterhead, professionally formatted with all the terms they'd discussed translated into legally binding language. Nadia took it with hands that trembled slightly, holding the paper like it might disintegrate if she wasn't careful. Leo returned from his window observation to ask what was happening, and she told him maybe a new job, but they'd talk about it later at home. "There's something else," Casimir added, the words emerging despite his intention to keep the offer clean and simple. "The cafe position comes with an employee meal program that extends to immediate family. Breakfast and lunch for both of you, on the house, as part of the compensation package." He watched her process this additional layer, understanding that food security was probably as important as the salary given her recent history of asking for expired cake. Nadia's composure finally cracked slightly, her eyes going glassy with tears she refused to let fall in front of strangers. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, returning to the question that clearly haunted her, because the answer didn't align with anything her experience had taught her about how the world functioned. "I don't understand what you get out of helping us like this. People don't just hand strangers jobs and solve their problems without wanting something in return." The question deserved a better answer than Casimir had given in the bakery, something closer to the truth, even if that truth was complicated and not entirely flattering. Because I can, he said finally, which was both honest and inadequate. Because I have resources that are meaningless unless they're used for something beyond accumulation. Because your son deserves to grow up with stability, and you deserve not to have to beg for expired cake to feed him. His voice carried more emotion than he'd intended, revealing the raw places her situation had exposed in his carefully constructed defenses. She was quiet for a long moment, looking between him and Marcus, and the offer letter she held like a lottery ticket she was afraid to check. I need to think about it, she said, which Casimir recognized as the beginning of yes, even if she needed time to convince herself it wasn't too good to be true. Talk it over with Leo. Make sure I understand everything. But thank you for this, and for everything you've already done. Even if I don't take the job, knowing someone cared enough to offer means more than you probably realize. They left shortly after, Nadia clutching the envelope against her chest, while Leo chattered about the restaurant's cool interior and whether they could come back to see the pigeons. Casimir watched them through the windows until they disappeared around a corner, then turned to find Marcus studying him with an expression that mixed concern with resignation. You're in deep with this, Marcus observed, not making it a question, because the answer was obvious to anyone who knew Casimir well enough to recognize when he'd committed to something beyond rational calculation. I know, Casimir acknowledged, pouring himself water from the bar because his throat felt suddenly dry. But turning away now would be worse than never starting. The logic was sound, even if the premise was questionable, a justification for continued involvement that both men recognized as post hoc rationalization rather than actual reasoning. But Marcus didn't argue, understanding that certain decisions couldn't be undebated once made, only managed in their aftermath. She's going to take the job, Marcus predicted, moving to stand beside Casimir at the window where they could see the park and the city beyond it. People in her situation don't turn down lifelines even when they're suspicious of the rope's source. But you need to be careful about what happens after she starts, because proximity breeds complications you're not accounting for. The warning was gentle but firm, drawing on Marcus's own experience with how helping people could transform into owing them or wanting from them in ways that destabilized carefully maintained boundaries. Casimir nodded acknowledgement without committing to caution because he was already planning the next steps of integrating Nadia into the restaurant's operations. He'd need to brief the existing staff about treating her normally, arrange for proper training, ensure that his involvement remained invisible enough not to create uncomfortable dynamics. The logistics were manageable. It was the emotional architecture that concerned him, the way thinking about her and Leo had started to occupy mental space previously reserved for business strategy and threat assessment. Set up a check-in meeting for Wednesday, he instructed, shifting back into operational mode because that was safer than examining his motivations too closely. I want to hear her decision directly, and if it's yes, we'll start onboarding immediately so she can begin the following Monday. Fast enough to matter, slow enough not to feel like pressure. Marcus made notes on his phone with the resigned efficiency of someone who knew arguing was futile once Casimir had made up his mind about something. The following Wednesday, Nadia called the number Marcus had provided and said yes to the job offer, with a formality in her voice that suggested she'd practiced the conversation multiple times before dialing. She started the next Monday, arriving 15 minutes early with Leo in tow to drop him at school first. Casimir watched from the second-floor office that overlooked the cafe, hidden behind one-way glass that let him observe without being seen, and felt something close to satisfaction watching her navigate her first day with nervous competence. 3 months passed with the kind of steady routine that felt revolutionary to someone whose life had been defined by chaos and scarcity. Nadia arrived at Meridian each morning with Leo, dropping him at school before her shift started, and the rhythm became muscle memory that replaced anxiety with something resembling security. The other cafe staff accepted her without question, unaware that her position had been created specifically for her, or that the owner watched her progress through one-way glass like a gardener, monitoring a transplanted seedling. Casimir maintained careful distance, receiving weekly reports from Marcus about her performance, but never appearing in the cafe during her shifts. The separation was deliberate strategy designed to prevent speculation about their connection or his interest in her specifically, but he found himself reviewing security footage more often than necessary, watching her interact with customers and coworkers with the kind of warm competence that suggested she'd been doing this work her entire life rather than learning it in real time. Leo thrived with the stability that regular meals and his mother's reduced stress provided, his teacher sending home notes about improved focus and participation in class. Nadia had framed the first positive report and hung it on their refrigerator, a monument to what difference 3 months of security could make in a child's development. She'd started saving money for the first time in years, small amounts that accumulated in a jar on her kitchen counter, like proof that the future might contain possibilities beyond mere survival. The shift happened on a Tuesday in February, when winter still had teeth, and the city felt like it was holding its breath against the cold. A man came into the cafe during the lunch rush, ordering coffee with the kind of casual authority that made experienced servers notice him, without understanding why. He sat near the window for 90 minutes, nursing the same cup while watching the street outside with the patient focus of someone waiting for specific prey to enter the trap. Nadia served him twice, refilling his coffee without engaging in the small talk she'd learned customers either wanted desperately or avoided entirely. Something about him triggered her instincts in ways she couldn't articulate, a sense of wrongness that lived beneath his ordinary appearance like a current running under still water. He left a generous tip and departed without incident, but she mentioned him to Marcus during the end-of-shift briefing, because her survival skills had taught her that ignoring bad feelings led to worse outcomes. Marcus thanked her for the observation and made a note in his report, then spent the evening reviewing security footage with the kind of focused attention that suggested Nadia's instincts were worth respecting. The man's face was familiar in a way that made Marcus's pulse quicken with recognition, pulling up files from Casimir's extensive intelligence network. The identification took less than an hour. Vincent Torres, a mid-level enforcer for the Castellano family, who'd been quietly building his own power base through strategic violence and careful alliance building. He called Casimir at midnight, knowing that sleep was something his boss approached more as optional than necessity. "We have a problem," Marcus said without preamble, launching into explanation about Torres and his appearance at Meridian. The timing was too coincidental to be accidental, suggesting that someone had connected Casimir to the cafe and by extension to the woman who worked there. The implications were immediate and dangerous, because Casimir's world operated on the principle that vulnerabilities were targets waiting to be exploited. Casimir felt ice form in his chest as Marcus explained, his mind already calculating threat vectors and response options. He'd been so careful about maintaining separation, ensuring that his connection to Nadia remained invisible to anyone who might weaponize it. But careful wasn't the same as perfect, and apparently someone had noticed his interest, despite precautions. The question was whether Torres was operating on orders or personal initiative, and whether the threat was reconnaissance or prelude to something more direct. "Pull all the security from the waterfront operation and reassign them to watch Nadia and Leo," Casimir ordered, his voice carrying the cold precision it took when violence became necessary. "I want eyes on them 24 hours, rotating shifts, enough distance that she won't notice, but close enough to intervene if Torres or anyone else makes a move." The resource reallocation was significant, pulling protection from business interests worth millions to guard 2 people who represented nothing except a complication he'd brought on himself. Marcus executed the orders without questioning the priorities, because he understood that arguing with Casimir about this particular vulnerability was pointless. The security team was briefed within hours, establishing surveillance perimeters around Nadia's apartment and Leo's school, with the kind of professional efficiency that came from years of protecting assets that couldn't protect themselves. Casimir spent the rest of the night in his office, reviewing everything he knew about the Castellano family and mapping the potential reasons they might target someone in his orbit. The Castellanos had been quiet competitors for years, operating in adjacent territories with enough mutual respect to avoid direct conflict. But recent expansion had brought their interests into collision over port access and distribution networks, creating friction that hadn't yet escalated into open warfare. Casimir had calculated that the situation could be managed through negotiation and strategic concession, but Torres's appearance suggested someone in their organization had decided intimidation was a more effective strategy than diplomacy. He could walk away from Nadia and Leo, terminate her employment with generous severance, and eliminate the vulnerability that Torres had apparently identified. The tactical logic was sound, sacrificing 2 civilians to protect broader interests, while removing the emotional complication that had been clouding his judgment for months. But the thought of abandoning them to whatever the Castellanos had planned made something in his chest constrict with an emotion that felt dangerously close to the loyalty he'd spent years learning to suppress as a liability. Instead, he called a meeting with Vincent Castellano himself, using back channels and mutual contacts to arrange a sit-down in neutral territory. The meeting was set for Friday evening at a restaurant in Little Italy that had been serving as Switzerland for organized crime negotiations since before either of them were born. Casimir prepared for the conversation by reviewing leverage points and mapping concessions he could offer that would satisfy Castellano's territorial ambitions while protecting what had inadvertently become his responsibility. The restaurant was called Fortunato's, occupying a corner building that had survived urban renewal through some combination of historical designation and convenient ownership. Casimir arrived with Marcus and 2 additional security, meeting Vincent Castellano's equivalent delegation in a private dining room that smelled like garlic and old wood and decades of deals made over plates of pasta. Castellano was in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, carrying the kind of old-world authority that came from inheriting power rather than seizing it through violence. Castellano greeted him with professional warmth that suggested this was business rather than personal conflict. "I appreciate you reaching out directly, rather than letting our mutual misunderstanding escalate into something regrettable." The phrasing was diplomatic, acknowledging tension while framing it as miscommunication rather than aggression. They settled into chairs across a table that had probably hosted similar conversations between men who'd killed for less than what was currently at stake. "Your man Torres visited one of my establishments," Casimir said, choosing directness over the elaborate verbal dancing that sometimes preceded these negotiations. "I'm interested in understanding whether that was reconnaissance on your orders or freelance initiative that needs to be addressed." The question put Castellano in position of either owning the threat or dealing with an employee who'd exceeded his authority, both outcomes that served Casimir's immediate interests. Castellano's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested genuine surprise that was either authentic or masterfully performed. "Torres was following up on information that you've been personally invested in civilian assets, which struck me as unusual for someone of your reputation and operational security." The response confirmed that Casimir's connection to Nadia had been identified and analyzed, though the extent of their investigation remained unclear. "I wanted to understand what had inspired such uncharacteristic behavior before proceeding with our port negotiations. The explanation was reasonable, reconnaissance in service of broader business strategy rather than immediate threat. But Casimir recognized the implicit leverage in Castellano's words. He knew about Nadia and Leo, which meant they could be used as pressure points if negotiations went poorly. "My personal investments don't impact our business discussions," Casimir replied carefully, neither confirming nor denying the connection while making clear it was off limits. "The port situation can be resolved through reasonable compromise without involving civilians who have nothing to do with our respective operations." Castellano studied him with the assessing gaze of someone trying to determine how much pressure could be applied before something broke. "I'm not interested in creating unnecessary conflict," he said finally, which was the closest thing to concession Casimir was likely to receive. "But I need assurance that your personal complications won't interfere with business decisions that affect both our organizations. The port access needs to be resolved in the next 30 days, and I need to know you're approaching negotiations rationally rather than emotionally." The meeting continued for another hour, mapping out preliminary terms for port territory division and establishing framework for ongoing negotiation. Casimir agreed to concessions he'd planned to offer anyway, trading control of specific loading docks for assurance that Nadia and Leo would remain outside the Castellanos' area of interest. The agreement was verbal and provisional, backed by the understanding that violation would mean war neither side actually wanted, but both were prepared to wage if necessary. He left Fortunato's with the temporary security that came from buying time rather than solving problems permanently. Torres would be pulled back from surveillance, but the vulnerability remained as long as Casimir maintained connection to people who could be threatened or harmed to influence his decisions. The smart play was still walking away, eliminating the emotional attachment before it became fatal weakness. But Casimir had spent 30 years making smart plays that left him wealthy and isolated, and some irrational part of him refused to sacrifice the first genuine connection he'd felt since his mother died asking butchers for bones. Nadia noticed the security within a week, recognizing surveillance patterns from years of being watched by landlords who thought single mothers were flight risks, and bill collectors who believed persistence would eventually extract money that didn't exist. The watchers were more professional than those previous experiences, maintaining better distance and rotating frequently enough to avoid pattern recognition. But she'd developed instincts about being observed, an animal awareness that made her skin prickle when eyes were tracking her movements even from blocks away. She confronted Casimir on a Saturday morning, showing up at his penthouse building with Leo in tow, and telling the doorman she'd wait in the lobby until Casimir agreed to see her. The move was bold to the point of recklessness, crossing boundaries they'd maintained carefully since she'd started working at Meridian. But fear for her son overrode social calculation, maternal protection instinct, making her willing to risk whatever consequences came from forcing this confrontation. Casimir came down to the lobby rather than having her sent up, recognizing that her presence here meant something had fractured the careful separation they'd maintained. She looked angry more than frightened, which suggested she hadn't yet connected the surveillance to actual danger. Leo sat on a leather couch playing a game on Nadia's phone, oblivious to the tension radiating between the adults who were trying to have a private conversation in a space designed for visibility and traffic. "Someone's been following us," Nadia said without preamble, her voice low but intense. "Different people, but always someone watching. I thought I was being paranoid until Leo mentioned a man who was at the park by his school 3 days in a row." Her observation skills were sharper than Casimir had anticipated, compromising the security arrangement's effectiveness while confirming his decision to implement protection had been necessary. She deserved explanation, but the truth was complicated in ways that might make everything worse. "You're not paranoid," Casimir acknowledged, making the calculation that partial honesty served better than lies that would eventually unravel. "The surveillance is mine. Protection I arranged because someone took interest in you specifically because of your connection to me." He watched her process this information, seeing the moment when fear overtook anger as she understood the implications. Her life had intersected with his in ways that brought danger along with opportunity, and now her son was vulnerable because of proximity to a world she'd never chosen to enter. "What kind of interest?" she demanded, her voice climbing slightly before she forced it back down to avoid drawing attention from the doorman who was pretending not to listen. "Who are these people, and why would they care about someone who serves them coffee?" The questions were reasonable, deserving answers that Casimir wasn't sure he could provide without revealing more about his business than was safe for either of them. But she was owed truth after he'd brought this threat into her life through his own failure to maintain proper distance. He suggested they move to the coffee shop across the street where conversation could happen without lobby acoustics, and decided that might represent leverage they could use against me in unrelated negotiations. The explanation was sanitized but accurate, threading the needle between disclosure and operational security. Nadia's face went through several expressions before settling on grim understanding. "Your mob," she said flatly, not making it a question because the pieces had apparently assembled themselves into inevitable conclusion. "The expensive clothes, the way people react to you, having resources to just create jobs and arrange security. I should have figured it out sooner, but I wanted to believe the help was what it appeared to be, rather than something with complications attached." Her tone carried disappointment that cut deeper than anger would have. "The help was genuine," Casimir insisted, leaning forward to emphasize sincerity. "What I offered you had nothing to do with my other business, and the complications came from my failure to anticipate that helping you would make you visible to people who look for vulnerabilities." His chest felt tight with guilt that was unfamiliar and unwelcome. Recognition that his good intentions had created exactly the kind of danger he'd spent his career learning to avoid or neutralize through preemptive violence. She was quiet for a long moment, watching Leo methodically pick chocolate chips out of his muffin and eat them individually. "So what happens now?" she asked finally, her voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "Do I quit the job, move to a different city, spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder wondering if the help you offered is going to end up getting us killed?" The scenarios she outlined were valid concerns, reasonable conclusions drawn from insufficient information about how completely Casimir had already moved to neutralize the threat. "The situation has been addressed," Casimir said, meaning the meeting with Castellano and the agreements they'd reached. "The people who took interest have been made to understand that you're off limits, that any action against you would have consequences they're not willing to face. The surveillance will continue for the next month to ensure compliance, but you're not in danger." He believed this was true, though certainty was elusive in a world where agreements held only as long as mutual interest aligned. Nadia absorbed this with the skepticism of someone whose life had taught her that powerful people's assurances meant nothing when circumstances changed. "And if they decide those consequences are worth it?" she pressed, drilling into the scenario that kept her awake at 3 a.m. "What happens to Leo if someone decides that getting to you is worth going through me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications about responsibility and the price other people paid for his choices. Casimir felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that his involvement in their lives had crossed from abstract benevolence into concrete obligation. "Then I'll handle it," he said quietly, the words carrying weight of promise rather than empty reassurance. "Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, you and Leo will be protected. That's not negotiable or conditional. It's simply what will happen." The commitment was dangerous, creating vulnerability in himself that contradicted everything he'd learned about survival in his world. But walking away now would make him complicit in whatever happened next. The weight of his declaration settled between them like a contract written in something more binding than ink, witnessed by the oblivious child destroying a muffin 3 feet away. Nadia understood instinctively that men like Casimir didn't make promises lightly, because their word was currency in a world where broken commitments could mean death. She'd spent months observing him from the cautious distance of employee to employer, cataloging the small gestures that revealed character beneath the expensive suits and controlled demeanor. The way he never raised his voice even when frustrated, how he remembered staff birthdays without being reminded, the fact that he'd created an entire job position rather than simply handing her charity that would have felt like pity. These details had accumulated into a portrait of someone whose capacity for violence existed alongside genuine desire to protect rather than harm, a duality that should have terrified her, but instead felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered in years. Casimir watched her process his promise, seeing the moment when fear transformed into something that looked dangerously close to trust, despite every rational reason she had for withholding it. The coffee shop around them continued its morning routine, people ordering lattes and checking phones while completely unaware that life-altering negotiations were happening at the corner table. He thought about his mother again, how she'd trusted the butcher's kindness enough to keep returning week after week until circumstances changed, and she no longer needed expired meat wrapped in clean paper. That trust had been rewarded with consistent dignity, a small mercy that had shaped Casimir's understanding of what power could be used for beyond accumulation and intimidation. Now he was offering the same kind of covenant to a woman whose desperation had accidentally reminded him that strength measured only by capacity for destruction was just elaborate weakness dressed in expensive clothing. She searched his face for several seconds, apparently trying to determine if she could trust declarations from someone whose entire professional life was built on strategic deception. "I don't want this life," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper so Leo wouldn't overhear. "I don't want to raise my son in a world where violence is how problems get solved, and people are assets to be protected or threatened. We were finally stable, finally secure, and now I find out that security came with a price I never agreed to pay." "You can walk away," Casimir offered, though the words tasted like failure in his mouth. "I'll arrange relocation assistance, new identities if necessary, enough money to start over somewhere with no connection to any of this. Give you back the anonymity that was safer than my protection ever will be." The offer was genuine, recognizing that giving her the choice he'd taken away through his involvement was the minimum ethical requirement of a situation he'd created through good intentions and poor foresight. Nadia looked at Leo, who'd finished his muffin, and was now drawing pictures on the paper napkin with a pen from her purse. Everything in her expression suggested she was calculating futures, weighing known danger against unknown possibilities, stable employment against freedom from complications she'd never invited. "If we stay," she said slowly, returning her attention to Casimir, "I need complete honesty about what that means. No more surprises, no more finding out months later that decisions were made about our safety without my input. Whatever this situation is, I need to be part of navigating it." The demand was fair, requesting agency in a situation where he'd been making unilateral decisions about her life under the justification of protection. Casimir nodded agreement, recognizing that her terms were reasonable and that continued involvement required partnership rather than paternalism. "Complete transparency from now on," he confirmed, extending his hand across the table to formalize the commitment. She took it after a moment's hesitation, her grip firm despite hands that were probably shaking with adrenaline and fear. They finished their coffee in careful conversation about practical matters, establishing communication protocols and decision-making frameworks for the uncertain future they were apparently choosing to navigate together. Leo remained oblivious to the weight of what had just been decided, focused on his drawing, which appeared to be a dragon fighting an airplane. When they finally left the coffee shop, Nadia walked differently, her posture carrying awareness of the security that followed at a distance, while her hand on Leo's shoulder suggested renewed determination rather than defeat. Casimir watched them disappear into morning crowds, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more heavily across his shoulders. He'd spent 3 decades building power through strategic ruthlessness, learning to see people as assets or obstacles rather than individuals deserving care. But Nadia and Leo had somehow bypassed those defenses, becoming real in ways that made their safety feel more important than the empire he'd sacrificed everything to build. Marcus would say this was dangerous, thinking that would eventually compromise everything. And Marcus would probably be right, but Casimir found he didn't care as much as he should about protecting what suddenly felt less valuable than what it had cost. The transition happened gradually rather than through single dramatic moment, Casimir's involvement in Nadia and Leo's daily life increasing through incremental decisions that accumulated into something resembling family. He started appearing at Meridian during Nadia's shifts, initially justifying the visits as operational oversight, but eventually abandoning pretense when everyone, including Nadia, recognized the pattern. Their conversations evolved from careful formality into genuine exchange, discovering shared perspectives on everything from Leo's education to the best pizza in the city. Leo accepted Casimir's presence with the adaptability of children who haven't yet learned that some relationships require complicated explanation. He started calling Casimir Mr. Wolf after mishearing his last name, and the nickname stuck despite multiple corrections because it made Leo laugh every time. Casimir found himself genuinely enjoying the boy's company, answering endless questions about everything with patience that surprised everyone who knew him professionally. The time spent with them felt like stepping into a parallel existence, where his choices hadn't hardened him into someone incapable of connection. Marcus watched this development with the resigned concern of someone who'd predicted exactly this outcome, but lacked authority to prevent it. "You're building something that can't coexist with what you already have," he warned during one of their strategy sessions. "Eventually, you'll have to choose between the Empire and whatever this is becoming with them." The assessment was accurate, but incomplete, missing that Casimir was increasingly questioning whether the Empire had ever given him anything worth more than what he was finding in small moments of ordinary domestic happiness. The holidays arrived with December cold that made the city feel cleaner somehow, snow covering the grime and softening the hard edges of urban life. Casimir invited Nadia and Leo to his penthouse for Christmas, a gesture that crossed yet another boundary between professional association and personal relationship. She accepted after visible deliberation, bringing wine that probably represented a significant portion of her discretionary budget and homemade cookies that Leo had helped decorate with enthusiastic incompetence. The evening was awkward at first, 3 people trying to create tradition where none existed, while navigating the class differences that made the penthouse's luxury feel obscene compared to Nadia's carefully maintained apartment. But Leo's excitement about the view and the Christmas tree Casimir had arranged specifically for this gathering broke through the tension. They ate dinner at the marble table that usually went unused, talking about Leo's school play and Nadia's co-workers, and carefully avoiding discussion of the security that still shadowed their movements or the business interests that funded this comfortable evening. After Leo fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from excitement and sugar, Nadia and Casimir stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights spread out like captured stars. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly, not looking at him, but at the reflection of both of them in the glass. "Not just for the job or the protection, but for seeing us when it would have been easier to look away, for caring when you didn't have to." Her words carried weight of acknowledgement that what existed between them had moved beyond gratitude into something more complicated and potentially dangerous. "You changed everything," Casimir replied, the admission feeling like removing armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten what vulnerability felt like underneath. "Before I met you and Leo, I had power and money, but nothing that mattered beyond accumulation. You reminded me that there are things worth protecting beyond business interests and territory." The confession was more honesty than he usually offered anyone, but something about the moment and the sleeping child and the woman beside him made strategic caution feel less important than authentic connection. Nadia turned to face him directly, her expression serious but not unkind. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing all the uncertainty about where their relationship was heading and whether the gap between their worlds could be bridged or would eventually pull them apart. "We keep navigating forward together?" The tentative hope in her voice suggested she wanted that outcome despite all the rational reasons it might be impossible or inadvisable for both of them. "If you're willing to deal with my complications and I'm willing to change enough to deserve the chance," Casimir answered, recognizing that transformation wasn't simple declaration, but ongoing process that would require dismantling patterns 30 years in the making. I don't know what that looks like practically, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. The statement was as close to a relationship declaration as he'd ever made, clumsy, but genuine in ways that felt more valuable than smooth delivery would have been. She smiled at him then, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since their initial meeting in the bakery. "We'll figure it out together," she said simply, taking his hand in a gesture that was both tentative and certain. The physical connection felt electric despite its innocence, a promise of possibility that existed alongside all the complications they'd have to navigate. They stood there for a while longer, watching the city and occasionally glancing at Leo sleeping peacefully, while the future they were choosing to build together remained uncertain, but finally felt worth the risk. The weeks that followed brought continued adjustment as Casimir began the slow process of disentangling himself from the criminal operations that had defined his adult life. Marcus handled most operational transitions, establishing successor structures and negotiating exits that wouldn't create power vacuums or invite retaliation from competitors who might see withdrawal as weakness. The process would take years to complete fully, but Casimir found himself increasingly invested in reaching the end state where his past didn't constantly threaten the future he wanted to build. Nadia watched this transformation with cautious optimism, understanding that people didn't simply abandon their entire lives without friction and occasional regression into old patterns. There were difficult conversations about specific business dealings that still required his attention, and moments when his instinct toward controlling solutions through power rather than partnership created conflict between them. But she also saw genuine effort toward change, witnessed him consulting her about decisions that affected all of them rather than making unilateral choices justified by protection or experience. Leo flourished with the expanded stability and attention, his academic performance improving while his personality bloomed into something confident and curious. He still didn't fully understand Casimir's role in their lives, but accepted him with the pragmatism of children who judge people by their present actions, rather than complicated histories. The three of them developed routines that felt increasingly like family. Sunday breakfasts at the penthouse, weeknight dinners at Nadia's apartment, Saturday afternoons exploring different neighborhoods, and eating at restaurants that Leo chose based entirely on whether they served chicken nuggets. By spring, Casimir had moved most of his legitimate business interests into structures that didn't require his daily involvement, creating space for the ordinary life he'd never imagined wanting. He attended Leo's school events, helped with homework, despite being hopelessly outmatched by third-grade math, and learned to be present in moments that had no strategic value beyond their own inherent worth. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was real in ways that made the sacrifices feel insignificant compared to what he'd gained. The evening they made the relationship official to Leo happened in June, 6 months after that first Christmas together. They'd taken him to the park where ducks fought over bread, despite the signs requesting that people not feed them. Leo asked with the directness of an 8-year-old whether Casimir was going to be his dad, and the question hung in the air while both adults tried to figure out how to answer something so complicated in terms a child could understand, without being weighed down by the full implications. "Would you want that?" Casimir asked, the question directed at Leo but with eyes on Nadia to gauge her reaction. The boy nodded enthusiastically, apparently having given this consideration already, and reached his own conclusion about desirable outcomes. Nadia's expression was a complex mixture of hope and fear, understanding that this commitment would formalize everything they'd been building while also making permanent a connection that couldn't be easily undone if circumstances changed, or if Casimir's transformation proved temporary rather than fundamental. "Then yes," Casimir said, the simple affirmation carrying weight of promise about futures he couldn't completely control but was choosing to commit to anyway. "I'd like that very much." Leo launched himself at Casimir with the full-body hug of someone who'd been waiting for permission to express affection without reservation. Nadia watched with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away, because sometimes happiness demanded visible acknowledgement, even in public spaces where strangers might witness vulnerability. The practical details took months to arrange, legal structures and family court proceedings that transformed informal relationship into official guardianship. Marcus handled most paperwork with the efficiency of someone deeply invested in Casimir's happiness, even while privately concerned about the complications this created. But by the time autumn arrived with its promise of new school year and changing seasons, the three of them had become legally and practically what they'd already been emotionally: A family built from unlikely circumstances and maintained through daily choice to prioritize connection over easier paths that would have kept them separate. Standing in his penthouse one October evening with Leo doing homework at the dining table and Nadia cooking dinner while singing off-key to music only she could hear, Casimir felt something he'd thought permanently unavailable to someone with his history. Not redemption, exactly, because the past couldn't be erased or fully atoned for through present goodness, but perhaps grace, the unearned gift of second chances, and the possibility that people could become something better than their worst choices. The bakery where this had all started was closing permanently next month, the owner retiring to Florida with enough money from selling the property that she'd never need to work again. But its legacy persisted in this moment, in these people who'd become his reason for attempting transformation that still felt uncertain but increasingly necessary. The road ahead remained complicated, filled with ongoing consequences from his past, and the constant work of maintaining changes that didn't come naturally after decades of operating differently. But for the next time, remember that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can change our lives in ways we never imagined possible.